Accessing library computer data.
Out there are no saints. Just people.
Hey, everybody. That was kind of a goofy entrance. But anyway, we're here to talk about our continuing coverage of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Right now, we're up to the episode called Our Man Bashir. It is the 10th episode of the 4th season. Aired on November 27th, 1995. Teleplay goes to Ron D. Moore. Story credit goes to Bob Gillen. Directed by Weinrich Colby. In this episode, a transporter accident replaces the characters in Bashir's secret agent holosuite program with the physical forms of the station's senior staff. Clay, how are you?
I'm good. I'm really excited that we finally got to witness Avery Brooks's final form, as I'm sure he was constipated for days after chewing so much scenery. But this is my favorite Avery Brooks performance. This is clearly what he wants to do all the time.
I have a note that I want to talk about here. Remind me if I don't say Wes, talk about your note. But we're also joined by Darren. Darren, welcome back to the podcast. How are you?
I'm good as well. Yes, I'm very, very much looking forward to this.
You had requested this episode.
Yes.
Your recent Twitter feed, you were tweeting about it. You had a lot of hot take hyperbole about the episode. Maybe not hyperbole.
None of it's hyperbole. It's all fact. It's all true.
Well, we'll take a break. I'm going to play an audio clip. We're going to come back. We'll see if Clay disagrees right off the bat, and otherwise we'll see if I have to play the naysayer about this whole episode. But anyway, we're going to take a break. We're going to play an audio clip. We'll come back with Darren and Clay. We're going to break down Our Man Bashir.
Julian, I must have fallen asleep.
Very funny. Who else did you invite along with you today?
Well, this wasn't my idea, Major.
Colonel, actually. Colonel Anastasia Komonanov, KGB. Oh, Julian. I never thought I'd see you alive again. Not after you fell out of that dirigible over Iceland.
I had a parachute, and there was a submarine there waiting for me. But how did you know about that? Have you been downloading my holosuite program?
Oh, Julian, you are not well. Let's lie down.
I must say, Major Kira's certainly throwing herself into the role, Doctor.
All right, we're back. Clay, Our Man Bashir, you had kind of a weird tone to your voice when I told you we had a holodeck episode featuring Bashir coming up. You kind of said oh, that was your tone of voice. So, do you want to describe what you were thinking, and did this episode live up to it?
The same tone of voice I use when I check the contents of the sandwich that I ordered
3 days ago.
Yeah.
Oh.
I think it's generally Bashir is not my favorite character on the show. I don't know if that's just because he's not featured as much, so he's fallen into the crevice of people I don't look forward to seeing. But I usually end up, every episode I see with him he's usually pretty good. And I actually did really enjoy this episode. It's a lot of fun. I've found it's interesting that they've had so many episodes that are just sort of fun side quests, given how serialized they've gotten. And it's the standalone episodes are more side questy and fun than they usually are. But yeah, I really enjoyed this. It's a holodeck episode with stakes that affect everybody, which is nice, and it's not just I forgot the keys to the door.
The machine didn't break down in this episode. Interesting.
Yeah, it didn't come to life.
Yep.
It's actually it made me start thinking about if when you're transported, is it really you who comes out on the other side, or is it just a synthesis of yourself? That wasn't the point of the episode, but I was thinking about that because they were talking about. Oh, and I also like to see that even far in the future, people still have RAM problems. Of
course. As far as technology goes, you're always going to need a bigger operating system or Skype channel, I suppose, on the other end. Darren, You were talking a big game about this one. Do you want to do your general thoughts introduction?
Okay. Our Man Bashir is an unqualified and underrated masterpiece of Star Trek. It is one of the best episodes of Deep Space Nine. It's one of the best scripts that Ronald D. Moore ever wrote. It's one of the best scores that Jay Chataway ever composed. It's one of the best, it's probably the best holodeck or holosuite episode in the franchise. It's one of the best comedies in the franchise, and it's just a delight from beginning to end. So yeah, I've sort of laid out my ground there a little over ambitiously, but I think it's an episode that really sort of testifies to the strength of the fourth season. Like, it's worth noting, Clay pointed out that he felt a sense of dread when he heard that he was going to get both a holodeck episode and a Bashir episode in one fell swoop. And I mean, you downplayed it. You were very nice to Bashir. You're like, maybe it's because he's not featured that much. But if we're being entirely honest, like, the Bashir episodes of the first three seasons include Passenger, which is the one where Bashir becomes a serial killer. Melora, which is the one in which Bashir learns a very important lesson about creeping on women with disabilities. Distant Voices, in which Bashir learns a very important lesson about not supplying drugs to people who want to buy drugs off him. So Bashir, doesn't necessarily have, up until in the first three seasons, the Bashir episodes aren't consistently great. And the ones that are great tend to be the ones that involve Garak, and they tend to be the exception rather than the rule. Think of The Wire in the second season. What's interesting about the fourth season, and this is one of those like firing on all cylinders sort of things, is that they have 3 Bashir episodes in them. They have the Hippocratic Oath, with O'Brien, which comes right after The Visitor, and I think is somewhat underrated because of that, because it's not a masterpiece of television following a masterpiece of television. There's this, and later on in the season, there's The Quickening. And there's a real sense, like, the fourth season of Deep Space Nine is the show figuring out exactly what it's doing. And a testament to that is that it figures out what it's doing with Bashir, who has been one of the biggest problem characters along with Jadzia Dax for the first 3 years of the show. And it finally figures out exactly what it wants to do with him and exactly the stories that it wants to tell with him. And I don't know how much depth you want me to go into it here, but I think that our man Bashir, like, it looks fluffy, it looks playful, and it's very funny. It's a wonderful, like, showcase of Star Trek production design. But in terms of story and narrative and character work, it's a story that understands entirely, like, the appeal of both Deep Space Nine, of Star Trek as a whole, and of Bashir as a character in the context of what Deep Space Nine is doing. And I think that's a fantastic accomplishment in general. And I think that, as Clay pointed out, it's a particularly impressive accomplishment in what is a trivial side quest episode, because nobody who isn't me is going to ever say Our Man Bashir is like the most important episode of Deep Space Nine ever. But even when it's not, it's doing so many of these small things incredibly perfectly well, I would argue.
Now, I have 2 things to say. One, if the episode called The Quickening doesn't feature a sword fight and some sort of vague mystical prize at the end, I'm not interested. And 2, be careful what you say here, Wes, because your opinion really determines whether or not you get to talk about the Royale in the future.
So that's a good point. Although, Darren, I noticed you had said the Royale was one of your favorite Star Trek episodes, so it might be just a tag team effort here against Clay, who doesn't like the Royale as much. But I think I'll start this by...
But when this train comes in, everybody rides, Clay.
Clay, I'll
walk, thank you.
I'll ask you... Here's my... I can't put up much of a... This is going to be a very boring podcast if I don't push back a little bit. The only pushback I can really have is that, Darren, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being James Bond himself, how much of a fan of James Bond are you?
I'm probably like an 8.5, if not a 9.
Clay?
7.
Okay, I'm the low end here. I'd be like a 3, probably, in the James Bondy secret agent world. My main problem with Our Man Bashir, and you guys can push back against this since you like it quite a bit, and I like it too, but the main thing is I think that it's one of those weird episodes where the homage is obvious, yet I walk away thinking they could have done so much more. And I don't really know why I feel that about this way. I really like the last half of this episode. I think the first half takes a very long time for it to actually get into gear and get going. They talk about what's going on for a very, very long time. And I feel like while I appreciate on a technical level, all the Bond and secret agent, it's not just Bond that they're referencing here, but he's the main target. I feel like it's all very, I'm technically impressed by it, but it's the kind of thing where, as I'm not a huge fan of Bond material in the first place, I kind of walk away going, that was fun, but it didn't really impact me on any way. It's not like if they set up like a holodeck Seinfeld episode, I would have been all over that shit, but we end up with a James Bond thing here. So Clay, why do you think I'm wrong about that?
Well, I would agree that I think it probably takes a little bit too long to get going. They spend too much time in the Paris house, I think.
Is that the one where Kira shows up?
Yeah. Also, why is it always Kira who ends up getting all sexed up? It's always her. It never seems to be anybody else. When are we going to see Worf in just a loincloth?
Actually, funny you should ask that. I think there's an episode coming up that will deliver what you want, Clay.
Excellent. It's the only thing that I want.
Golden Speedo.
And the scene with, I think of all the scenes with all the characters and their new versions, I think the Worf one is probably the weakest. Although it does have that nice line about, where's my $5 million? And he says, it's right in front of you, implying that he's going to beat him in Baccarat, I think.
Yeah, Baccarat.
That's a nice line. But he gets the least amount of stuff to do and doesn't really get to play a character. He's just sort of Worf with a suit on.
Clay, he does so much business with that goddamn cigar. It's like a porn movie that you're watching while he's working that thing.
Well, you got to keep it interesting somehow. Shit, what was I going to say? I think it's falls in the same subset for me as like a mirror universe episode, but I find this to be more successful. In that they're letting the actors play different characters, and it's kind of fun to watch because you're so used to them as X, and now they get to do Y, even though Dax is basically just Dax and Worf is basically just Worf. But Kira gets to stretch her legs a bit. Avery Brooks gets to play the role of he's been waiting to play his entire life.
He's playing the role that they thought he was being cast for, I think. You know, so I'll bring up my point now. Avery Brooks is a bizarre casting for DS9 because it seems like the characters he wants to play are high energy, and Sisko is not high energy. It's such a weird casting. It's like it's not his natural state of being to be this buttoned up commander of a space station role. He is the yelping, spastic, sort of semi-dancing person that he wants to be, and it's weird. So, Darren, I'll throw it to you off of Clay's point, but how would you sort of react to the point about being a Bond fan and enjoying this, and where you think we can go into the characters after that, too?
So just on a general sense, in terms of this being a movie about the Bond, or an episode about the Bond franchise, and it's worth noting that this was released in November 1995, which was the same month that GoldenEye was released. And GoldenEye is a wonderfully underrated Bond film. It's the one that gave us Pierce Brosnan, arguably Pierce Brosnan's only good Bond film, but it was the Bond film that was kind of tasked with reintroducing Bond after the Cold War and figuring out how to make a Bond movie after the Cold War, after the character was seen sort of redundant and out of date, before Casino Royale did it. That's it, exactly. Off a dam, in a grey and depressing Soviet environment. But yeah, so that was sort of like, that was the context of this. And one of the things I really, really like about our man Bashir, and it was sort of like, well, it kind of gets to something about Deep Space Nine that I really, really like about Deep Space Nine as well, is that, like, obviously it's packed full of all sorts of references and homages and sort of like nods to all these detailed, like all these little in-jokes to little Bond movies that people will recognize. There's Baccarat from Casino Royale, for example. The rotating bed is obviously the bed, meant to be the bed from like You Only Live Twice, except the production team didn't have the budget to have her just drop out of the wall. There's also discussions like The Spy Who Loved Me, where he's like, he jumped out, he had a parachute and landed in a submarine. I like to imagine Bashir with a Union Jack parachute. But there's also even like little things like the Nehru jacket that the villain's wearing, the Dr. No is wearing, which is obviously a nod to the iconic costume of Blofeld, which even popped up in Spectre. There's things like the control board, the Himalayas, the plan to annihilate mankind, which is a very Roger Moore Bond movie villain from like The Spy Who Loved Me, but also from Moonraker. But on top of like ignoring all of that and the fantastic like 60s production design and the fantastic soundtrack, what the episode does that I really like is it kind of touches on what the appeal of Bond is as a film franchise, and in particular what the appeal of it is as a movie franchise about a spy. And it happens with Garrick, and it's kind of interesting because in a way, like a lot of Deep Space Nine, this has aged very, very well because it seems to preempt some of the discussions that the Bond franchise has had itself. So like when Daniel Craig showed up, all of a sudden Bond wasn't the guy in a tuxedo drinking martinis, shaken not stirred, because how else do you drink martinis? He was all of a sudden this rough and ready, bruised, emotionally scarred guy who, you know, would pummel a dude in a toilet. And it's sort of like you stripped out the romance of Bond because that's what people thought they wanted from a post-Cold War Bond, from like a post-90s Bond. They wanted somebody who was brutal, somebody who was horrific, and somebody who made really dark and tough moral choices because they absolutely had to be made. And one of the things that I like about our man Bashir, and it's very similar to what... Have you guys seen Mission Impossible Fallout earlier this summer?
Yes.
Clay has,
so
I have not, yeah.
Okay, well, without getting too specific in terms of plot, in terms of theme, one of the things I like about the Macquarie Mission Impossible films is that they very much try to position Mission Impossible as distinct from Jason Bourne and as distinct from the Daniel Craig Bond films. And they do this by embracing a very romantic view of spycraft, because they're not really movies about spycraft. They're not really about espionage. Nobody really believes that the United States government conducts its espionage in the style of Tom Cruise riding a motorbike backwards around a roundabout. It's more in the style of like, these are the action movie fantasies that we like to have, and the idea that these are stories and these are particularly interesting to us as stories. And like there's a lot of that in our man Bashir. Like for example, Bashir mentions that he has to be at work in 2 hours, yet somehow in the holodeck he's able to get from Paris to Hong Kong without having to take a flight in real time, which makes you wonder how it works, but it's moving by story logic. There's a wonderful bit at the end where Dr. Noah, who is like, he's finally got the upper hand, he's pointing a gun at Bashir. The holodeck program's about to end. He goes over to push the button and fulfill his dream and have the one thing that he's wanted to do all this time, and he hovers his hand over and he can't actually do it because the story won't let him do it. And even at the end when Bashir pushes it, he says, I didn't expect to win. And he didn't expect to win not because he's a character who wanted to conquer the world, but because he's a villain in a Bond movie, and villains in Bond movies don't get to win. But there's this discussion that happens throughout our man Bashir between Garak and between Bashir, which is a wonderful dynamic. And I think we'll talk a little bit about how it reflects Deep Space Nine later on, but it talks a lot about fiction in general. And there's this idea that happens at the climax of the episode. And you're right, the second half of the episode is much, much stronger than the first half. And the second half is so strong because of that dynamic between Bashir and Garak, where Garak is like, look, this little fantasy that you're playing at, this little role play of this globe-trotting, like super wealthy dilettante who travels around the world and seduces beautiful women while living in expensive buildings at the taxpayers' sort of expense. That's a fantasy. That's not what a real spy does. A real spy murders people in the dark. A real spy throws people under the bus if it serves their interest. A real spy understands that you have to take measures and you have to be willing to make sacrifices, and you have to be willing to accept acceptable losses. And Bashir's
the real spy runs away,
to,
basically.
Cowers. Like it's a brute, basically. He's not a romantic figure. And Bashir's response to that is to say, screw you, and to say, I can actually do all this impossible stuff. I can beat the odds. I can do something that's completely unrealistic, something that completely rejects your cynicism of I have to let them die or I have to save myself. I can reject that because I'm inside a story, and stories exist to allow us to be wonderful and to be our best selves and to be optimistic and utopian and hopeful. And I really, really like that about our man Bashir, because it's a homage to the fantasy of Bond, to the idea of like constructing a story where a spy isn't somebody who does something horrible in a dark alley and tries not to get caught, but instead lives a fancy jet-setting life where he can save everybody on the planet because he's a decent person, or save everybody who's important to him because he's a decent person. And that's what I really, really like about it. And that's why I think has aged really well as a commentary on the Bond franchise.
I do also really like that Garak basically voices everything I've said previously about people with professions in most stories and movies where they're not very good at their job. Like James Bond is a terrible spy in real life, and I got a kick out of hearing Garak actually voice that. Yeah.
It's a clash of Garak's realism against Bashir's fantasy stuff, and
right.
It is kind of, it's as Darren is saying, it's like the smashing those two together allows Bashir to have a fantasy of a fantasy character, and you know how Bond has changed from the idealized like Cold War warrior where it was clearly fighting against communism, the sort of the battle lines were clear, to Craig's Bond, which came about in the age of more Islamic terror and everything like that, and is a little bit more shades of gray, a little bit more brute force, I guess, less romantic. Still having sex, just not romantic sex.
Not healthy sex, like really angry sex. Shoot the woman afterwards and waste the scotch sex.
So I think that the Bashir thing, and I'll ask you, Clay, like, so how much Darren obviously is very interested in the sort of the theme of it. How much of that did you come across in the episode, and how much did you see it just as a Bond homage? Because I kind of split the difference. I actually feel that they could have done a little bit more with the thematic take of it, but I feel the episode teeters a little bit towards the lighthearted side, and I don't think that's a problem, but I think it actually could have been deepened a little bit with what they were talking about with the Garrick stuff and everything. But what would you think?
Yeah, I just thought it was a nice way to play in that world and invert a lot of the expectations of how those stories play out. Like Darren mentioned at the end, where Cisco, or Dr. Noah, is that his name?
Yeah,
Noah?
Dr. Noah.
Oh, that's cute. I don't think I caught that the first time.
Which is, I think that's my favorite reference. It's Dr. No, and he's trying to flood the world, so it's Noah biblically, which makes a lot of sense. I think that's great.
Him not expecting to win, and then Bashir turning the tables and winning by killing everybody, I thought was fun. And the Garrick stuff allows them to kind of make some comments on how silly these stories are, but Bashir then gets to talk about why they're so engaging, and I really enjoyed it. It's an odd thing to choose for Star Trek. It's like it's strange to me that they took an episode just so they could kind of like muse about James Bond for a while. Yeah. Like if they did an episode. What's that?
I was going to raise my hand there, but you continue there, Clay, sorry.
Like if it's as weird to me as if they decided to do well, I guess they've kind of done it in the past, where they've done the Sherlock Holmes episodes and stuff. But yeah, it's like if they decided to do an episode where they just decided to talk about the tropes of vampire fiction for 40 minutes.
Talk about that for a second. TNG chose Sherlock Holmes as an inspiration for the holodeck, basically, right? He's the one that springs to mind for Data.
Yep.
DS9 chose James Bond. And I think that's kind of an interesting choice. It's an interesting distinction between the series. We always talk about that. But I think that Sherlock Holmes fits TNG more than Bond fits DS9, although if you guys can convince me that Bond fits DS9 in a better way than Sherlock Holmes fits the mechanical, unemotional side of TNG, then I'm all ears.
Well, I would argue that Sherlock Holmes fits TNG, but more specifically, it fits Data. And James Bond might not fit Deep Space Nine, but it specifically fits Bashir. So if it had been anybody else in this episode, I don't think it would have worked. But Bashir definitely has that sort of
why do you think that?
It doesn't. I mean, just the way he is. He's not a womanizer, but he's clearly a horn dog.
Yeah,
and he's tries to keep it classy, but also is it doesn't surprise me that this would be a fantasy of his. Let's put it that way. And if this had been a James Bond spoof where O'Brien was doing a James Bond thing, that would feel really weird. But I think it's just appropriate given. I don't know if they said, let's do a James Bond thing, and, well, who should we use? Oh, I guess Bashir makes sense. Or if they said, let's do a Bashir holodeck episode. Oh, Bashir, we should have him do a James Bond. I don't know which, chicken and the egg situation here. But I think character-wise, I think it fits Bashir very well.
Darren, did you want to go off of that?
I kind of just a couple of things on that, because I think actually it's kind of interesting. I would argue that Bond fits very well with the sort of milieu of what Deep Space Nine does and the interest that Deep Space Nine has. In that Deep Space Nine has a lot of interest towards like mid 20th century popular culture. I think that like TNG has a much more classical sensibility, as you point out, with James Bond, but also with like westerns and stuff like. Sorry, no, with it's Sherlock Holmes, but also with westerns and stuff like that. Whereas Voyager, when it gets invested, it's invested in like pulp fiction from the 30s through the 50s with like Captain Proton, but also like communist scares and stuff like that. Whereas Deep Space Nine's interests repeatedly lie in sort of like the golden age of Hollywood. Sort of we're talking, or even like going into new Hollywood. So think, for example, how many episodes of Deep Space Nine have been based off classic movies? Like, for example, Profit and Loss based around Casablanca, Mirrodin based around Brigadoon, to pick another example. Fascination based around the 1932 version of it's a Midsummer Night's Dream, for example. Yeah,
and let's not forget Duet, which is based on the jazz singer.
It's true though. Ira Behr is he would be my father of the Star Trek showrunners. He's interested in things that are just before my time. Like I as a non-cinephile, I'm sort of unfamiliar with a lot of the references that DS9 does. So I guess you can continue, Darren. But it is like DS9 is very interested in early golden era movies.
It's worth noting, like, that, for example, Behr later on in this season hires 2 writers based solely on the fact that they wrote a book about Sam Peckinpah. Like, that's the kind of...
Do you know their names off the top of your head?
David Weddell and Bradley Thompson for Rules of Engagement, and they later become staff writers in something that I have very strong opinions about. But we're not going to get into that right now.
That's why the slow motion squib shots go up in the 5th and 6th season. Right?
Just by sheer volume. But I mean, like, Behr also, even later on, it's telling that when he uses the holosuite, for example, he uses it to depict like mid-20th century American pastimes like Vegas, or even like the baseball games, for example. Like, I mean, one of Behr's first things when he sat down with Michael Piller about being brought in to work on Deep Space Nine was, I want to bring back baseball into the 24th century, and that was sort of a part of like what he wanted to do with the show. So I think Bond sort of fits roughly with that within that context. But I think it also, Armand Bashir, for me, and maybe again this is something where I'm probably reading far too much into the episode, but it also works rather well for me as a Star Trek episode, as a story exploring like how we tell stories, in particular how we tell Star Trek stories, because obviously like you've got a number of parallels between the Bond franchise and Star Trek in that they both began sort of in the 60s. They both, like, in their early days had a certain horn dog sensibility that's been maybe toned down a little bit, and they've sort of gone through various iterations, and they changed to reflect the society around them, and they've been reinvented. And you could argue that like Armand Bashir arrives at a time where Star Trek is reinventing itself with like The Way of the Warrior at the same time that Bond is reinventing itself with GoldenEye. But there's this interesting thing within Deep Space Nine where a lot of people tend to comment upon Deep Space Nine as an inherently cynical show, as a show that is deconstructionist, that adopts a very cynical outlook towards Roddenberry's idealism. And this kind of ties back into the use of Bashir in this episode, because I think, Clay, you're entirely right that like this is an episode that I can't imagine working with anybody but Bashir. Bashir is, despite the fact that it takes him nearly 4 years to get a good episode, with the exception of The Wire, probably one of my favorite episodes, my favorite characters on Deep Space Nine, because he's basically a Roddenberryan protagonist on the show, in that he's a character who embodies that TNG sensibility in terms of he's the most idealistic, he's the most overperforming. He's the one character in the cast who's, when he's introduced, doesn't really have a big issue or a reason to be there. He's just there because he's overperforming. He's there because he's the guy who you could easily swap Bashir out with any other character on Voyager or Next Generation when you're starting it, and you wouldn't think anything was wrong whatsoever. Whereas Sisko is like damaged coming off like the loss of his wife, for example. Kira is a former terrorist. Odo used to work for a fascist bunch of enforcers. Quark is a greedy capitalist. O'Brien is like this working class individual. And so like Bashir is like the most pure Star Trekian character on Deep Space Nine, and it happens repeatedly over the early seasons. Like, it's repeatedly suggested the characters on Deep Space Nine can't stand Bashir because he's very much like a first season character from the Next Generation. He's all talky, idealistic. He's sort of like projecting himself outwards. He's talking like he knows what he's talking about, and he's sort of asserting his view of how the universe is. And there's a point where, like, I think it's Battle Lines, which is not a great episode, but it has a really great moment where, like, Sisko's like, okay, these people are suffering horribly. We need to get them off this planet. And Bashir's like, yes, but have you thought about the Prime Directive? And Sisko just literally pushes him up against the runabout and says, shut the hell up. Like, this is not that kind of story. Yeah, not on this show. Thank you very much. But, like, What's interesting is that despite the fact that Bashir is presented as naive and hopeful, and there's a sense that in some ways presenting him as like the hopeless geek and the little horn dog in the style of Gene Roddenberry himself, and as a little nerdy and awkward, is like the show thumbing its nose at the Next Generation just a little bit. It's also very clear that the writers and Deep Space Nine as a whole absolutely love Bashir. Because like if you look at the stories that center on Bashir, and particularly like that focus on his naivety and his innocence, his optimism and his utopianism, Bashir is always right. You guys have already watched in this season Hippocratic Oath, which is the episode where O'Brien and Bashir are captured by the Jemadar. And basically, Bashir's like, this is horrible. These people are being kept as slaves. We have to free them. And O'Brien's like, you can't free them. They're animals. They'll kill everything in their path. Them being on a leash is a really good thing. And that's O'Brien's position in that episode is the very cynical, grounded, realistic one. But at the end of the episode, Bashir is proven correct because the Jem'Hadar, who is not addicted to white, sacrifices his own life in order to protect Bashir and O'Brien and get them off there. So Bashir gets the luxury of being entirely correct. And it happens repeatedly with the Bashir episodes as you go on. And in this episode in particular, you have this conflict. It's almost a reflection of The Wire, which was another episode focusing on Garak and Bashir in the second season, where Garak is suffering and he's addicted to this implant. And Garak's big arc in The Wire is, I'm a horrible person. I deserve to suffer. I deserve to die. Nobody can love me. And if this person who's trying to help me, who thinks that he can come in and fix me and make things better, what I'm going to do is I'm going to push him away. I'm going to push him away by showing him how horrible I am. All the terrible things that I've done, whether they're real or not, because I don't deserve his compassion and I don't deserve his love and I deserve to be left in a hole, rotten and dying. And Bashir finds it within himself to forgive Garak for all the horrible stories that he tells and to go out and to put himself in danger to help Garak. And he does in the end help Garak. And here you have that inverted, where Bashir is in a situation where he's technically out of his depth and Garak is the guy with the expertise who should be coming in and help. And Garak's like, well, look, I actually know what it's like to be a spy. You should listen to me. You should like cut your losses. You should just walk away. You should, basically you have to make a tough choice. And Bashir's like, I simply refuse to make that tough choice. And the episode proves him entirely correct. Like, it's worth noting that
to be
Bashir
fair, though,
points...
he does kill the entire planet. He does.
That's a fair point, Clay. I'm going to choose to ignore that. But no, it is a fair point, but they are all holograms as opposed to the central point of the narrative is that Bashir at one point points out, and I think it's a very clever, very canny reference that like doesn't get enough credit. It's the point where he says, like, if this program ends like all the other ones, the computer is going to kill either Dax or Kira, and I'm going to end up with one of them, and the other one's going to be dead and forgotten about, and I'm never going to mention her again. Because that's how James Bond movies work. And the episode basically says, well, what if Bashir could try and break this story and make it work better? And I really like that about it. I think it works remarkably well.
And as far as why James Bond and does it fit or does it not, I would say that it arguably does fit. Maybe not in style, but in the context of the characters and what's going on. Because if you look at what's happening in Deep Space Nine, it's very Cold War adjacent. It has the same kind of feel of...
They are in a Cold War right now.
Yeah, they are in a Cold War. And you've got lots of different cultures who are untrustworthy, and you're always kind of like looking over your shoulder and everything. And all of the throwbacks that they do, at least the ones that I'm aware of right now, you've got James Bond, you've got Roswell, and you've got... they literally go back to the 60s Star Trek eventually. And those are all, I think, tonally consistent as far as the environment and the kind of political things that are going on at the time. So I feel like it is. I feel like it fits better than you might think.
So that's kind of an interesting point I never thought up. They don't bring the Dominion into this, and the Dominion would be the main sort of thing as the Cold War antagonist. Although I understand what you're saying is that the whole universe in DS9's Prism is kind of a Cold War with everybody.
Well, yeah, but it's just like the lens of the show is very much a Cold War lens.
Yes, paranoia is kind of the name of the game, not knowing what people are doing.
Yeah, you've got that stuff going on with the Cardassians. I mean, even I'm actually kind of surprised that there isn't a point where Garak is kind of like, I actually really enjoy this. This is very this is very recognizable to me, the way that these people are acting with each other.
Garrick is, not to derail, but Garrick is obsessed with the decor of this era. He mentions it multiple times that he doesn't like the color code and he doesn't like the way things are laid out. I thought it was actually one of the best looking 60s sets. It was like a good 60s is how I would describe it.
It actually, I mean, this is probably just my own bias, but his place in Paris, for a quick second, I thought was based on a
Danger
set
Man,
from Danger Man. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that episode. Yeah.
I don't know if it probably isn't. It's probably just like generic 60s decor, but you know.
No prisoner references in this episode, Clay. I don't think.
It's too cool for Star Trek, man.
It probably. Well, Bear was wearing that "I Am Number 6" T-shirt.
That's
so
true. He was.
It's in his head.
No reference to. Too bad there wasn't a reference to like a giant white ball or something.
So it would be a giant white line in this, or maybe that's a little bit early for Bond actually. Bond never.
Or if somebody asked Bashir if he was Polish, and he'd be like, "Why would I be Polish?"
Right. You told me there would be no checks here. So let's see. I want to talk about Bashir. We've sort of done that. I think that a good place to kind of go off here maybe would be the character work, because you guys are or maybe Clay or one of you was saying that you were kind of sort of ranking the cast. I think the cast is either knocking it out of the park here, or they are doing what they are best at, and I say that in Dax's direction more. That sounds negative, but they put her in a role that is like what she's sort of built for. But Avery Brooks was born to play a maniacal, insane Bond villain. He loves it. He cherishes it.
Having no real experience with him as an actor outside of this show, I am shocked that someone didn't, sweep him up to do something like this somewhere else afterwards, because he's really good at it. Like, I mean, he probably needs a little bit of dialing down, just a bit. But I mean, if they came out with a Bond, if Bond 25 or whatever comes out and Avery Brooks is the villain, I'd be like, fucking yeah, I'm there for that.
It'd be Idris Elba versus Avery Brooks.
Yeah, now we're talking.
So yeah, let's talk about Brooks. I would rank the performances basically. Dax and O'Brien are kind of at the bottom. O'Brien doesn't have a lot to do. He's just the henchman goon. Kira is good. Kira is more of a Rocky and Bullwinkle parody than anything else.
As you were saying, sorry to interrupt, but as you were saying about, they gave Dax something to do that they know she could do. That kind of explains why is Kira always the one being sexed up, I think, because it's like if you put Dax in the Kira position, it's like oof. I don't know how that's gonna go. I don't know if she's got the chops to pull that off. Nothing against Terry Farrell as an actor, but
yes,
here we are.
No, I completely understand, and I mean the lead ones for me are Bashir, Cisco, and I actually enjoyed Worf. I thought Worf fit what's the name of the henchman from Casino Royale, Le Chiffre or something like that?
Yes, yeah.
Le Chiffre. He's kind of playing that role, I think. And
yeah, he's not doing, his character is not meant to do anything flashy. And in that character, he does that well, because I mean that's kind of what he does. So I mean it's a good fit. I was just kind of, I don't know, I was expecting a little bit more of something different like they gave to a lot of the other ones, and not just the same character with a pair of glasses on like they gave Dax.
Looks good in the tux. Darren, did you have anything you wanted to say about any of the characters, or Clay, whoever, if you have something you want to say about the characters that we haven't mentioned?
I don't know, I'm a big fan of Brooks, particularly Brooks's sort of scenery chewing stuff. And it's interesting, you mentioned earlier on that, like, it's weird how they cast Cisco, how they cast Brooks as Cisco, given that, like, Cisco's meant to be this deeply troubled, introverted, relatively quiet individual. And Brooks is like, feed me, I demand scenery and sacrifice. And there's an interesting thing there, because, like, that's what I think... The fourth season works so well because it allows Brooks to be Brooks, not just in obviously letting him shave his hair and have the goatee and stuff, but there's a sense after the fourth season that they begin leaning into Brooks's performance style. And many of like the big episodes coming up that focus on Cisco, like Far Beyond the Stars, obviously, or like in The Pale Moon Night, or even Take Me Out to the Holosuite, all hinge on like Brooks's performance style, which is like completely unleashed, and that sort of happens around the fourth season. The fourth season is where you really get to see Brooks going all in, and I actually really like that, because Brooks, for me, it's always halfway between like the classically trained Shakespearean actor of Patrick Stewart, who is probably like the best or at worst second best actor in the franchise history, and William Shatner, who I realize is an acquired taste, but who I absolutely adore. And I kind of love that.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think Brooks Unleashed is way more over the top than William Shatner ever was.
Yes, I'd agree with that.
I think they should replace the communicator click with just a track of him going, blah! Because he loves to do that.
Just randomly going wild.
Do you think he waits and he's like, so you're going to come in on the close-up? Tell the guy on the boom mic maybe to back off just a hair. It's going to get loud.
Well, he's a trained opera singer, isn't he?
He is, yeah. He's an opera singer, yeah.
That's interesting.
I mean, his performances to me are... Brooks, to me, has actually shown himself across the course of the series to be a better director than he is an actor. His directed episodes are actually standouts for directing choices, and I can kind of understand that. I feel like he became an actor, but it's really not really what he's all that great at. He's fine at it, and it's weird that he's a man of such extremes. He does the incredibly high energy stuff, but when they're like, listen, Avery, you got to really pull in like fire in the gut Cisco here, like smoldering Cisco, do that. And he's really good at that too. So it's this weird middle ground where when he's in the middle, he will kind of have these weird yelps mixed in with stuff. And you're like, well, you don't really need to play it this way. Like you're just kind of doing a normal thing. And he's a man of extremes. That would be my description.
Yeah, I think he, where I said he's more over the top than Shatner ever was, I think the difference is that he has a lot more of a tighter lid on that stuff than Shatner did. Shatner went from zero to silly pretty easily, but Brooks, it works better for him, I think, because he keeps it under wraps most of the time. So when he does get to do that stuff, it has a little bit more weight to it, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of my favorite Brooks moments tend to be moments that are almost incongruous in terms of, like, I love this performance, I love all the big episodes focusing on him, but it's little things like, for example, Dramatis Personae back in the first season, which is also the episode that gave us Sexy Kira. I think we can safely credit it with that. Like 7 years of Sexy Kira come down to Dramatis Personae. But the moment where like Cisco is wrestling with a dude in ops and throws him into one of those pits, and then having done that proceeds to like vault over the pit into it like I'm not done yet, which is one of those great Brooks moments, which I absolutely adore. And you're right, I think that this episode works so well because it all builds that fantastic monologue about this completely insane plan. Because I'm not a geologist, but I'm fairly sure that the Earth's surface doesn't actually shrink like a balloon.
Yeah.
But it's like I feel like I can go with it because Brooks is just I'm watching it. It's just transfixed. It's going into my brain.
Hey, scientists, it's called magma when it's under the crust. You fucking idiots! It's not lava.
I could point to a specific.
That's your issue.
I could point to a very specific legendary comic book illustrator who might have a different opinion.
Okay.
But I won't name names here.
No safe spaces.
And no Kneel by Knife, no.
I mean, I think that the plot to me feels very Bondy. I guess this will just be a segue into the sort of ending. I think that the ending scenes, if the entire episode had been the ending scenes where they're all in a group together at the very end, like on a single set doing these things, I would have really appreciated. That was the Bondiness aspect of it there, and I really enjoyed the subverting expectations. That's on my mind now because I just watched The Last Jedi for the first time. But subverting expectations, they did that at the end, and it was very satisfying. So do you guys agree? Did you like the homaginess of the early goings, or would you have liked that little subverting to have gone the whole way through? Or do you think that the subverting is what causes the plot to hinge, and that's how you have to resolve it? I would have liked to have had a little bit more, less homage-y and more sort of playing with the ideas early on, and I didn't really get that.
Well, I think, okay, let's put it this way. Mozart was very famous for writing variations on a theme, right? And that stuff really only works when you know what the original version is, right? So, you would have the original version, and then Mozart had like 4 different versions that he would just kind of change stuff and invert it and all this kind of stuff. And I think that kind of that's kind of how these things need to go a little bit, where before you can really start inverting it, you need to kind of play within the universe a little bit first.
Play fair. Play by the rules.
I think the same thing goes with art. It's people who are really expressionist or very abstract painters, like your Picassos and whatnot. Those guys could paint the fuck out of a realistic portrait. Like those guys knew what they were doing.
That blew my mind. There was this thing on Reddit that showed like the eras of Picasso.
Yeah,
and his early stuff is photorealistic.
Yeah.
Portraits. It's like astounding to see what he started as.
Yeah, and the reason why those guys were so good at that stuff is because they knew what they were deconstructing. They were fully versed in what they were deconstructing. And so I've always felt like in order to do that in the most honest way, regardless of what medium you're working in, you kind of have to be knowledgeable of the world first. And if you're something like Star Trek where you're playing in a different sandbox, I think it's totally fair play to spend maybe 10 minutes or however getting you into the vibe of the James Bond world and all the trappings of it before you start putting little twists on it.
Darren.
I'd agree with that almost entirely. And I think it's interesting you should mention The Last Jedi, because I don't want to derail the podcast, because mentioning The Last Jedi anywhere is going to derail everything.
I'm going to bring it up at the end.
Just to stir it. But one of the things I really like about, like, I'm on the fence about The Last Jedi. I think it's ambitious. I like its ideas. I'm not so keen on a lot of the execution, and I think it's interesting. I think it's worthy. And one of the things that I like about The Last Jedi is I think it only really works, if it works at all, because it follows The Force Awakens. Because The Force Awakens is such a conventional, safe, forward, straight up, this is a Star Wars film, and then you watch The Last Jedi afterwards, and it sort of plays with that stuff. Now, I know, obviously, you could just watch the original trilogy and you'd understand that, but I think the two of them together as a duology work rather well. So I would agree with Clay that, like, to get the second half of Our Man Bashir, and the second half of Our Man Bashir is amazing, you kind of have to spend a little time at the start, particularly for, like, and I wonder... This is something I'm curious about, because you guys are both Americans. Like, and you mentioned your enthusiasm for Bond. It's like you guys were like, maybe a 7, maybe a 3. Like, is Bond popular over there, and would he have been as popular in the 90s over there for people who weren't like into films as he is obviously in the UK and Ireland, where he's like a big deal, particularly in the 90s when he was an Irishman?
Honestly, I don't know. I couldn't tell you the U.S. response to Bond in general. It seems fairly positive. Like, I know a lot of people who are really into it. As far as people of our generation, it's probably, I would say most people our age probably got more into it once Daniel Craig showed up, because by that point it was so, played out and parodied that I feel like it needed that hard reset to get a new generation of people into it. And I personally, the main reason I said 7 is because I do enjoy James Bond. I love James Bond movies generally. But I feel like James Bond has always been better up until Casino Royale for me. James Bond has always been better as a concept than actually as a movie. Because they're generally way too long. And they're generally not as exciting as I kind of hoped they were, at least when I was younger.
Yeah. We have
I love GoldenEye. I don't like really any of the other Pierce Brosnan ones, but and that's
also fair.
Yeah, and there's so many of them. Like there's like fucking 25 of them. There's so many that I don't even know some of them. Like every now and then one will pop up and I'll be like, I've never even heard of that one. And I'd say like everybody who's been a Bond has like at least one movie that was good to really good. But that's not a great average across 25 films. So it's interesting. I can understand why it's a much bigger cultural thing in the UK and in Ireland. But yeah, I think people here generally enjoy them, but I don't know if it's as widespread a phenomenon as it is elsewhere.
I think over here with Bond, you either like Bond or you don't. There are no semi-casual Bond fans who are like, new Bond film is out. I'll go check that out. That doesn't exist. The people who go to see Bond films over here have seen all the Bond films, I feel like.
I have a friend of mine who, just because she does this for some reason. She feels the need to do this. She'll tackle series of movies, and then she has to watch all of them. Like recently, she was like, I'm watching all the Batman movies. Let me know what order I should do. I'm like, all right, your funeral. But she recently did James Bond, and it took her like 3 years to do it because she got about halfway through, and she was like, Clay, every one of these movies are exactly the same. They're 2 hours long. They're so boring. When are these supposed to get good? And it was the kind of thing where it was like, yeah, every now and then one would pop up. She'd be like, yeah, that was pretty good. But generally it was just, oh shit, tonight I have to watch a goddamn James Bond movie.
You know, some people say now there's like TVs are being played as movies. The Bond films are a TV series that was accidentally made into a movie.
Yes. Yeah.
That's because they are very formulaic. They're very adventure of the week style. They're very sort of like, they're very contained, but they each have a very familiar formula. And you're right when you point out that like all of them are interchangeable. Like you can point out that, for example, The Spy Who Loved Me is a straight up remake of You Only Live Twice, to give an example. And like the Roger Moore Bond movies are particularly egregious because they do the standard Bond formula while also being what's popular at the moment.
Yeah.
So it's like space movies are popular. So let's send Bond into space. Silicon Valley's popular at the moment, so let's have him go to Silicon Valley.
I will say, however, one of those ones that were like in that dead zone of the middle that I didn't know existed, I did watch. I can't remember the name of it because all the names are like, 2 ticks away from being the same thing. It's the one
something who's something to me.
Yeah, it's the Roger Moore movie where he has to protect. It takes place in like the Alps, and there's like skiing. And he has to protect like this figure skater or something.
Eyes only.
That
it's
movie,
for your eyes only.
That movie is great.
It's the best Roger Moore Bond film because it's the only one where he has an actual character, and also where he doesn't creep on the underage girl.
Yeah,
which also helps.
I never hear that movie talked about, and it's the best of the Roger Moore movies. I know people
it's
really
the
love.
Smallest one.
Yeah, people really love. What is it?
The Spy Who Loved Me.
Nope, I was thinking of Paul McCartney. Live and Let Die.
Oh, Live and Let Die.
People really like that one.
Blaxploitation Bond.
I never really liked that movie. It's okay. It's got some good stuff, but For Your Eyes Only was, I thought, legit good.
Bond?
Yeah, no, I would be a big fan of For Your Eyes Only. That would be my favorite of the Moore Bond films, particularly because it has Julian Glover playing this wonderful low-key villain, Christoph, whose deal is basically that he likes selling stuff. That's it. That's his deal.
Charles Dance is in it as well, in a small part.
Yes, as a dune buggy driver.
Yeah. So thanks everyone for joining us on the Pensky File James Bond podcast.
Well, do we have any? That's why I don't call the show a pun of Star Trek. I'm not like Trekonomics or Trekadiddly Doodad or anything like that. It's just the fucking Pensky Podcast here because we talk about everything. Do we have anything else we want to talk about before final thoughts? Does anyone have anything they want to say about this actual episode?
Just very briefly, Garrick's characterization in here I absolutely love because there's this sense that like because Bashir is entirely right that Garrick is offended by this portrayal of his work and the job that he does and like what he did for a living. And one of the interesting things about Garrick, and we talked about this when we talked about the Dias cast and Probable Cause, is that Garrick over the course of the show is somebody who is changed by the Federation and by being around people like Bashir, even though he doesn't want to be. And there's that wonderful conversation in The Way of the Warrior about root beer and how insidious it is and how it gets inside you and it changes you. And one of the things that I really love is the sequence where they have the big shouting match in the cavern, where Garrick like turns to Bashir and says, "You're a man who dreams about being a hero because you know deep down that you're not." Let me just say the holosuite isn't the only thing that's projecting at that moment in time, because that's got nothing to do with Bashir. Bashir is a hero through and through. Bashir has always been a hero. It's consistent in his characterization, but it's Garrick who has basically always been the coward, who's always been nervous, who's always been scared, who's always been ashamed of what he is. And there's this moment where he's confronted with this idea of Bashir role-playing as the thing that he's been for all his life and not being a coward and not being sort of a sniveling wreck. And he's sort of offended by that, which I really, really like. I think that's a really great characterization.
Clay, did you have any thoughts about Garrick? I agree with everything Darren was saying, but did you have any thoughts about Garrick's ending or where Garrick stands at this point?
No, I thought he was great. I liked him because he was kind of the one, on top of what Darren was saying, he was also the device to voice the discussions about how kind of silly the James Bond stuff is. Yeah. Which I think was done in a more interesting way than if they had not had somebody there to do that. And they didn't do it in a super obvious way. Like, it was still a character appropriate way. It wasn't just someone else there being like, well, this is kind of dumb, don't you think? Isn't it kind of weird? You know, it's the way they do it a lot in modern stuff now, where it's like just someone there who says, isn't it kind of weird that blank and blank happens, but never cynic, blank? You know, that kind of thing. But yeah, I thought...
I liked his, he has some really good lines in this, I think, when Bashir's like, take down your hair, and Garrick's like, I'm knowing more about your fantasy life than I really needed to learn.
I particularly love when he wakes up in this like Himalayan paradise, and the first line he utters is another decorator's nightmare, which is just so perfectly Garrick.
I will say that I think he's a little bit underutilized, because he just sort of is. Yeah, he's just sort of there to kind of let Bashir verbalize what he's thinking and to counterpoint and point out the absurdity of some of the tropes. And there are some scenes where he's there, but you just kind of forget he's even in them because, you know, they don't cut to him very often.
Question. Would you, if I were to rewrite this script, I think one thing I would do, if they gave me a half hour to rewrite it, I would do one small change. Let me know what you think about this. I feel this is an episode that would have greatly benefited from one of the cliche Bashir and Garrick are having lunch cold opens. Would you agree, or is that too far?
I could see that.
I think this all comes down to I wish there was just a little bit more there. Garrick is good at the end. I just wish they had introduced that idea a little bit earlier to make it seem like it was a cohesive thread that ran throughout the entire episode, and it doesn't really feel that way at this point.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I think the only issue with that is possibly timing-wise, because you'd have to then cut from them
from
having lunch together. Yeah. That's it, yeah. You'd have to have, like, from them having lunch together to Bashir having apparently gone off on his own to being the holosuite to Garrick being there as well.
You know, I wouldn't be surprised if that scene exists, like in the original version of the script, now that you say it, because Garrick's appearance in the holodeck is so just random that it wouldn't surprise me if there was a scene where they were having some sort of, you know, lunch or whatever, and then Bashir was like, I gotta go. I have to go do this thing. I don't knock on my door. I need to learn how to read.
Don't look at me.
Yeah.
And then, and, you know, Garrick is then interested in what's going on.
What's going on.
It wouldn't surprise me.
So that's actually a very plausible idea.
We don't need to talk about this too much longer. We're going to wrap this up, but we didn't talk at all about the Ferengi, Odo, and Eddington working on the outside. Is there anything to say about these guys? Good to see Eddington again. I like the bit of Rom's business where he's using like spatulas and drains to like fix up Quark's thing. Also, why are the holosuites only breaking even for Quark? How does that work?
Yeah, you would think that would be like the highest money-making thing.
I have a theory, and my theory is this. There's a point later on in the show where Quark decides to use one of the holosuites to run a bar that's open 24/7. So why would you pay for food and beverage in Quark's when you could just go up, pay for the holosuite for an hour, and eat whatever the hell you want? I think Quark's business practices
would that be real food dodgy. Though? I mean, doesn't that?
Do you walk out hungry?
Yeah.
Does it just disappear afterwards? Well, it assumes it has to be replicated.
If it were me, I would probably use the holodeck to just go and like eat Chinese food for 24 hours straight, and then be able to walk out and be like, well, that was satisfying, but didn't actually affect me at all.
Is that, do you think the holosuite is only invented to make that joke about you eat Chinese food and you're hungry 3 minutes later thing impossible in the real world? Is that what you're telling me?
No, you know, it's like, I would definitely be the guy where it's like, yeah, everybody else is joking about using the holodeck for some weird sex thing, and I'd be like, man, I just want to eat like 2 pizzas, like full, straight through. Have a chocolate shake afterwards and like a box of donuts and not feel gross afterwards.
Mundane utility. It's like the least satisfying thing. It'd be great if that's what Garrick walked in on, was Bashir binge eating.
I knew
you'd be a very different episode.
I knew you'd be in here eating a pie. I thought it was something else, but this is exactly what you're in here doing.
Yeah, or it would be something like I would go into the holodeck, and then if somebody came in, it would be it would not be any different. It would just be like my normal quarters, and they'd be like, what the hell, why are you even using this? And I would say, honestly, I just want people to shut the hell up for like 20 minutes. I just want to be alone.
You tell them you wanted to get away, and it's just like your real world in the holosuite.
Yeah.
All right,
exactly.
We're done with this episode. We're going to take a break. We're going to play an audio clip. Me, Darren, and Clay are going to come back. We're going to read some Patron thoughts, give our final thoughts, and then we will call it a day.
And what is it? You understand, Mr. Bashir? That you should have killed me when you had the chance. I agree. Then again, I suppose it wouldn't be very heroic. I, on the other hand, have no pretensions about the idea of being a hero.
Wait. Maybe I'm tired of being a hero. Maybe I've thought over what you've said and decided that you're absolutely right.
About what?
Everything. The decadence of the world, the need for order. The more I think about it, the more I realize that your way may be the only way.
All right, so Patron thoughts. If you support the show on patreon.com/thepensky file, you get to leave your thoughts about upcoming episodes. We read them on the podcast. Holly McLaughlin says, TNG sold us on the idea that transporters are far and away the safest transportation possible. A transporter accident ought to be such a crazily unlikely occurrence that nobody has a clue how to fix it. They should be frantically studying what to do because none of them have ever done it before and really have no idea where to start. It doesn't make
Remember in the first Star Trek movie
when
when
the guy
that
died?
Vulcan got vaporized
Yeah.
by the transporter?
That was very that was very motion picture Star Trek right there. Kirk was just kind of moping around after killing that guy for an hour. It doesn't make sense to me that the computer doesn't just pull their likenesses on the holodeck characters, but not any other aspect of their stored brainwaves. This one is cheesy and silly, but has the redeeming element of it being fun to watch the actors playing new characters as an ensemble. Stephen Cobb says, similar to Little Green Men, Sabotage ship acts as a catalyst for putting the characters into a setting in Earth's past. Both have high stakes, and the heroes in both need outside help to get back to home/reality. That said, DS9 had been on the air long enough to earn a fantasy episode, and this one was well done and acted, and the music was spot on. Oh, well, yeah, we haven't talked about the music. I'm just going to say, music is good to me in a Star Trek episode if I notice it, and I noticed it here.
Yeah, music was great. Yeah, I like the music a lot.
This was the second fantasy episode of the season. Zam Nuclear Wessel says, indicative of DS9 that holodeck episodes are almost always about the holodeck making things better or saving the situation. Rather than creating the problem, here's the solution. Here it's the solution. Interesting that Eddington and Odo trying to fix things from the outside the game is almost exactly like pre-Eddington and Odo doing the same back in Move Along Home. Joint Mango says, our man Bashir, Eddington is the worst Canadian ever. Apart from that, this episode is bomb. Kiss the girl, get the key. They never taught me that at the Obsidian Order. Kyle Barrett says, I love this episode. Sure, it all comes down to due to a silly situation with the station essentially wiping its cookies in order to store the crew's consciousness after yet another destabilized warp core. But once the clunky explanation is out of the way, it's so much fun. I've been a big James Bond fan since before I was a Star Trek fan, so it's cool to see the franchise merge like this, with the episode poking fun at the Bond tropes just as much lovingly as it plays into them. It's also nice to see Bashir play Baccarat because it's the Bond's game of choice in the books, but we rarely get to see it in the movies, only 4 times by my counting. Kyle's a big Bond fan. Maybe it's just my weird obsession with Bashir and O'Brien's relationship, but I've always thought it would be interesting to have the holodeck place O'Brien into one of the female roles, maybe as Honey Bear, and Bashir would have to woo him like he does with Dax in this episode. Well, that could have been fun.
I mean, to be fair, the scene between Falcon and Bashir, where Falcon gently caresses Bashir's face with the gun before pressing it under his chin lovingly, I feel like you're not too far off the idea of the bed turning around and Colin Meaney lying in it going, oh.
Events in the holodeck could have somehow paralleled events on the station, so characters other than Garrett could have learned something from the experience, but I don't really care. It's incredibly entertaining as it is. It's one of my favorite episodes of the show. Neil Brennan says, our man Bashir, a stupid amount of fun. 2 more. Matthew Ross says, our man Bashir, I really like this homage of James Bond, even down to the wah-wah trumpet blasts. Humorous, but another ship in the bottle, TNG, bad holodeck and transporter magic episode. And here's an odd thought. Whose holodeck is it? Quark's? The station's? And I see suddenly the tech expertise of Odo and Eddington come forth. When did neural energy come separately? Oh yeah, this episode only. Rom's tech speak and spatula technology is clearly ahead of anything else in the known universe. As for the silliness inside the closed world, the over-the-top characterizations and ridiculous names, galore, are a nice Bond references, but not DS9. They said let's have a holodeck issue with a Bond theme and make Garrick the real-world spy comparison, or they just needed something to fill in the schedule. Regardless, no real stakes and pure silliness make it just a fun, fair episode. Bashir does not...
So...
Go ahead.
No, finish what you got. Finish the thing.
Oh, his last sentence. Bashir does not return and Latinum is forever.
So, Darren, as a James Bond aficionado, who makes a less believable scientist, Dax or Denise Richards?
Well, I mean, Dax doesn't wear hot pants, I feel. I feel like that maybe gives her a bit of an advantage here.
That's fair.
Sadly, though, Bashir never gets to utter the line, "Christmas only comes once a year."
Yo,
which
that
is
is-
like that's my like, you know, the way that like you have like your fantasy casting thresholds, which is like you have to, if you want to check if an actor will work in a role, you need to put them in both the best moment that the character has and the worst moment and see how they'll work. And like the Bond test that every actor fails is delivering that line, "I thought Christmas only comes once a year," without it seeming like a line from a knowing line from a Marvel film. And like Donald Gleason is the only actor I can possibly imagine delivering "I thought Christmas only comes once a year" and swigging a glass of champagne while looking like an absolute twat and doing it convincingly.
I feel like that line is like in the box where they keep the Glengarry leads of James Bond lines, where it's like a secret box where it's like, we have this line that we've been waiting to use for 60 years and we can only use it once. We have to choose the right time to use "Christmas only comes once a year."
I think when I saw that movie, I
think he's attempting re-entry is another one of those.
That's a good one too. Yeah.
I think when I saw that movie, I was like with my grandmother, I would think too, and I must have been just like, "Grammy, what does that mean?" It was definitely a learning experience for young Wes. Last comment here. Ike J says, "This episode is interesting in that it shows how Star Trek is comfortable enough with its own writing to create stories that are naturally colorblind. Worf, Bashir, and Sisko all feel very natural in a genre where race has historically been handled poorly. A fun exercise for me is updating the episode for today's cultural climate. You could probably make Dax the villain and play off Bashir and Dax's history. It would give further reason as to why he would destroy the world for her. And O'Brien, the scientist that Bashir seduces, since in today's era, you can toe the line between bromance and romance." Everyone wants to see Bashir and O'Brien fuck, but apparently it's not going to happen, guys. Get over it.
Guys, go on the internet, search that, and I'm sure it will come up.
Anyway.
And if it doesn't, someone will do it soon.
If it doesn't, your Google search has been, your parents have been fiddling with your search results, so go in and turn off the parental controls and you'll be able to find it.
There's another Patreon threshold for you guys, I think.
For some reason, popular culture / fiction is like a tulpa. If enough people think of it, it magically appears. So we may have just willed that into existence by talking about it.
All right, so our ratings, 1 to 5 scale. Clay, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm going to go 4, I think. Yeah, that feels right, because it's better than average. I don't know if it would be the first on my list to show people, but I feel like it's definitely a more enjoyable episode than some of the other ones I've seen.
Did you like it more than Little Green Men, which is kind of a similar episode?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, I would agree.
I feel like the story's a little bit cleaner in this one.
There's more to do.
Yeah, there's more to do, and there's less like third act, everybody shuffle around because we can't really figure out what else to do. And Odo doesn't show up in this one as like secretly transformed into Oddjob or something.
Yeah, Bashir or O'Brien throws his hat and Odo is the hat or something. Darren, what are you going to give this one?
That would be great.
This would be a 5 for me. This would be like one of my favorite episodes of Star Trek ever, although that's absolutely no surprise, given that I opened with the idea that was an underrated masterpiece. But it is, and I think it's a fantastic piece of Star Trek, a fantastic piece of television, a fantastic piece of Deep Space Nine, a wonderful character study, a wonderful piece of genre work. And we didn't actually talk about it much, and I know that this is not the time to introduce it, but I also really like Ronald D. Moore as a comedy writer. We talk a lot about how he changed Star Trek and he sort of introduced this sort of nuance and depth and darkness. But Moore, for my money, is one of the better comedy writers in the franchise. He also wrote, for example, the first script he was supposed to write for the show was House of Quark, which is also similarly underrated. He ended up writing The Search Part 1 because I think Robert Hewitt Wolf went off on his honeymoon. And then he also, later on in the third season, he writes Looking for Parmok in All the Wrong Places, which I think is the only time the phrase Star Trek sex comedy can be uttered without elucidating a shudder, which I really like as well. So I really love our man Bashir.
I'm going to give it a 4 as well. I really enjoyed it. It's an above average episode. I'm sure if I loved Bond, I would like the episode a little bit more than I do. But as it stands, I like it as like a technical achievement for the show. I think that the actors have a lot of fun with it. The scenes where they're all together are really great. The script is kind of fun. It is just it's a very solid episode of the show. It's enjoyable at this point. It's something that you can easily watch and sort of relax with. If you love Bond, you're going to love that episode.
Do the rest of the episodes this season, are they more normal Deep Space Nine episodes for the most part, or do they do any of these like side quests kind of light episodes? The reason I ask that is because I feel like on another show, having Little Green Men and this one so close together would feel like they're running out of ideas.
We get back to, there's a big two-parter coming up for us, which are the next two episodes.
You know what I mean, though? It's like...
Yeah. I do.
It's like they're running out of stuff to do, so they got to, get off the station, but they can't get off the station because that's the whole point of the show.
Well, that was Stephen Cobb's point, is like, you just did this. Like, isn't it too soon to do this again? I would kind of agree with that. The production line of TV makes it difficult, but I could understand if I was watching this in real time, I think that might be a concern of mine at this point.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's it. Guys, thank you very much for listening. Thank you for supporting the show. If you wanted to leave your comments, it's patreon.com/thepensky-file. Anyway, you can check out the social media. All the links will be in the video description. Facebook, Twitter, Discord, all that stuff. Patreon.com/thepensky-file. You want to support the show, that's the best way to do it. If you don't want to do the Patreon, you can just rate us on iTunes. It's much appreciated. We're almost at 50 reviews. If we get to 50, I'll be very, very happy. You'll make my day. It's easy to do it on your phone. Just go to the podcast app on your iPhone and rate the show. That's all there is to it. It is the internet currency. It means nothing to you. It's free. Just give it away. Give it to me. That's all we need. Pretend I am your Bashir and you are my O'Brien, and just give it to me, baby. Let's see here. So, what do I want to do?
I can't unsee that. Thank you very much.
Just imagine Bashir rating on iTunes as they're making love, and that'll be everything that you need it to be.
Oh boy.
Let's see. So that's it. Now, as always, we give a shout out
beyond his 5 stars, eh?
We give a shout out to the Captain tier patrons: Stephen Cobb, Nathan Elliott, Michael Pond, Matthew Cutler, Will Yates, Matt Flores, Samuel Custer, Santos Gonzalez, Robert Cummins, Andrew Chirlog, Spinobi, Russ Graham, Eric Johnson, Dexter Sebastiani, Neil Brennan, Bradley Killens, Jay Stanley, Mike Burnett, Matthew Ross, Ben Douglas, Kyle Barrett, Joint Mango, and Tarek Latif. Thank you guys very much. You make the show possible. We only do DS9 because of you. That's about it. My non sequitur, and check out Darren's stuff. Darren's Twitter will be here. Check out Clay's stuff as always. I'm just gonna say I saw The Last Jedi and Infinity War, and it's clearer to me than ever that Star Wars has kind of lost its way. And I didn't even really hate. I'm not gonna go up here and rant about The Last Jedi. Last Jedi bored me, and watching Infinity Wars in context with it showed where Star Wars has kind of gone wrong. That's all I'm going to say for my sort of thing. I know we're covering them at some point, but if people wanted my thoughts about those, and that's it. Infinity War was fun to watch, and The Last Jedi was not fun to watch. That's the way I would describe it. I couldn't believe that there were 40 minutes left in The Last Jedi when I checked the thing after Snoke dies. Yeah. And I was like, are you kidding me? 40 minutes? I'm over this movie. What is happening? Why is there 40 more minutes? And there they were.
I'll give you the best summation of Last Jedi I was ever witness to, which was I went to see it with Dave, our fellow Star Wars podcast host, and his 2 sons. And his younger son checked out about half an hour in, and then for the last 20 minutes he kept asking both of us when it was going to be over.
Yeah,
and then begging. As soon as it said written and directed by Rian Johnson, he just went, yes.
Star Wars. You guys can look forward to our coverage about that. Darren, thank you very much for coming on.
No worries, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, guys.
Clay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Guys, check out Darren and Clay's stuff. Check them out on Twitter and all that jazz. And otherwise, we'll be back with our next episode, which I believe is Homefront is the next one, and then Paradise Lost, the 2-parter. So, guys, thank you very much for supporting. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.